Palestine was just a region, much like we'd consider the Mojave Desert a region of the United States. The first time that term is used in history is around 70 AD, when the Romans decided to call that area of the world Palestine. It didn't have a distinct culture, it didn't have a distinct language. There was no thought, really, of a need to create a separate state of Palestine by anybody until the issue of Israel emerged.
The confrontation between the Arabs and the Jews started only with the Zionist movement and with the immigration of the Jews from Europe and other countries to this area. For us, they were foreigners. They were totally different than the Jews who were living here for centuries.
Jews who came to Palestine were escaping oppression in Europe. They came as refugees. They bought land. In Israel, they bought them from real estate speculators and absentee landlords, and they built themselves a community.
The country was not desolate before Zionism arrived. People who were the cultivators, who had the right of use of their land under traditional Islamic law, now simply tenants. And the new owners were exercising their modern Western property rights and expelling them.
It was when the Jews began to immigrate to the area in larger numbers, creating jobs, creating economic opportunity, turning the deserts into gardens again, that the Arab population began to increase.
Herzl said, let's give a land with no people to a people with no land. And the people with no land, he was referring to the Jews. And the land with no people, he was referring to Palestine. They denied the existence of my grandfathers and great-grandfathers.
British policies at the early part of the century, when they were controlling Palestine, created many of the conditions of conflict that we have today, because they limited the number of Jews who could move to what they had themselves said would be a Jewish homeland.
Well, one of the worst periods in Jewish history was, of course, in the 1930s, when the rise of Nazi power was on the horizon and Jewish lives were threatened. And the British Empire at the time limited Jewish immigration into Palestine.
And this made it impossible for Jews to escape from Europe during the time of the Nazi occupation. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Jews were condemned to death by Britain's refusal to allow Jews to enter Palestine. There were Jews who engaged in acts of violence prior to the creation of the State of Israel. These were the exceptions, not the rule.
After a bomb explosion on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel was razed to the ground.
They were routinely condemned and, in fact, turned in to the British authorities by the Jewish establishment authorities.
While certain kinds of terrorism, which were used by extreme groups, were looked upon with horror by everybody in the Zionist movement, other forms were a vital tool.
The General Assembly passed a resolution to establish two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, in the former British mandated territory of Palestine, with an international enclave in Jerusalem. The Arab League sent their armies to invade Palestine and prevent the application of the resolution.
We did not accept the partition plan because we thought that it's unfair to take our country and give it to foreigners coming from Europe.
From the Arab side, you had this hatred for Israel, and then you had from the Israeli side the determination and the feeling that we are under siege, that here's this tiny state surrounded by hundreds of millions of Arabs determined to remove it from the map.
Arab countries, army, entered Palestine in that time to fight a Jewish army. Arab's army told Palestinian people, you have to go outside of your village for a few days because we will fight and we will win the war and you will come back. Yeah. But the truth was not like this.
No sane human being with children stays where shells are falling if they have a safe place to go. People flee out of necessity. But parts of Palestine were cleared of Arabs by a military operation.
When Israel was created, Palestinians became refugees. We became to be known as the refugee problem.
It's a real tragedy that we have still today hundreds of thousands of refugees living in camps.
The United Nations created a refugee agency designed not to solve the problem, but to keep it going and ferment it. They define refugee uniquely. You are a Palestinian refugee from Israel if you lived in what is now Israel for 2 years, 24 months, even if you just went there to work.
This refugee crisis has been perpetuated by the Arab countries, which have not sought to bring these people into their countries. They have systematically kept the Palestinian refugees in camps because it serves their purposes, to fan these flames of hatred with Israel.
The Arab governments, they are a big liar. The Palestinian people waiting till now to return to their own villages, till now.
Most Palestinians still believe that they have certain rights, whether rights to property, whether rights to compensation, whether a right to return to some part of Palestine, or whether a right to return to their homes if their ancestors were made refugees in 1948.
You cannot allow 4 million people who have the weakest claim of refugee status suddenly to flood Israel and to demographically turn it into yet another Palestinian state.
If there are practical difficulties and barriers and obstacles on the ground which will not enable them or allow them to go back to their homes and their lands, let us sit together and negotiate how we can solve this problem.